All right, we're sitting in the studio talking e-scouting, big plans for this fall, and we thought we might as well do a video on it. So this is all based on our hunting experience on public land, our opinions. It's a little bit subjective. Everybody has a different method to their madness, right? But here at Exodus, we're kind of a mixed bag of tricks, I guess. We have guys like Jake who are into land management, habitat management. We have guys that hunt private by permission. And then you have like us two, I guess, misfits.
Knuckleheads, yeah.
Knuckleheads, knuckle draggers that are out pounding public land all over the country. And we do it for, everyone has their reasons why they do it. We think it's fun. But with that, when we're looking at new pieces, we really are just trying to qualify them, like just as a starting point, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to point that out. So we're trying to qualify an area to then look for these priorities on that piece. So when you're looking at going somewhere new, a lot of times if you're traveling somewhere, you don't have the opportunity to put boots on the ground until you're ready to hunt it. So you have that scout, hunt mentality. A lot of that scouting can be done with your phone or your computer on Google Maps or e-scouting with OnX, HuntStand, HuntWise, whatever you use. But in order to qualify a piece, you have to set priorities for what matters to you when looking for somewhere to hunt.
100%. So what we've done here is we've kind of each prioritized four things. Four things that I look for, four things that Cameron look for, and we're just going to talk through them.
Sure. Yeah. I think the first thing to say here, one of these priorities that we didn't put on here was obviously having public access. So, and when you're going out of state, if you're going to a certain county or you want to go to a certain area, or if you're hunting Iowa or Kansas where you have to pick a unit, part of the process here, the first step you should do is, okay, how much public is in this area? Or how much land that I can hunt is in this area? That's number one, because you could pick apart a piece of private that you can't hunt with all of these priorities, and it does you no good because you can't hunt it. So number one is not mentioned in here, and that's access to public land.
Yeah, that's kind of taken for granted, I guess. Like if you're hunting public ground, you got to have access to it. Yep. So start from number one. Give me your number one. What is the very first thing, the highest priority thing you're looking for e-scouting whitetails?
So we talked about this a little bit before, but it's going to depend on the time of year that I'm looking to hunt this piece. But for the majority of people saving a vacation time, they're going to do it in the rut. So
yes,
we're going to base this off of we're going out in November, late October, November. So the first thing when I'm qualifying a piece, so I have an area and there's a bunch of public, whether it's walk-in, government ground, whatever, I personally start looking for water. So okay. I want to find an area that has water. Once I find an area that has water, I don't really dive into, like, it could be a creek, it could be ponds, it could be a full-on river. I just gravitate towards hunting pieces that have water. So that's number one for me. And then I begin to dive into the rest of these. So I'll start to qualify a piece, okay, it has water. Then I'm looking for diversity. And I want to find some type of edge. Deer are creatures of the edge,
100%.
So to speak. So you got to have some type of diversity or edge. And I guess there's hard edge, there's soft edge, there's a bunch of different rabbit holes that you can go down there. But to define edge, it's some type of transition between habitat.
Yep.
It could be terrain or it can be habitat.
Yep.
But for number one priority here being diversity, we're going to talk about habitat diversity. So whether that's hardwoods, clear cuts, or that's straight up woodline to a field edge or CRP ground, any type of diversity or edge is going to be like, that's your starting point. Like you qualified this piece. Okay, now where are you going to start looking? Where there's the most diversity is going to be your starting point.
Yep. I actually have diversity / edge as my number one over water. And I have that because all the points you just made, deer are creatures of edge. And typically, whether you talk to a biologist, a land manager, primo whitetail hunters, everybody kind of understands and realizes the more diversity you have, the better whitetails are going to flourish. Like they don't like monocultures. So that is my starting point.
Yeah, that's one of the easiest starting points. Okay, that's where you're gonna find the sign that you can follow the sign, like you said, either towards the food or towards the bedding. That's the transition that a lot of people are talking about. So
If you're somebody that's been following the Exodus brand over the last 7 years, that have been hung up on trying one of our reliable, dependable, and borderline bulletproof trail cameras, we got a special campaign just for you. Starting right now, you can trade in any working or non-working camera and save $75 off an Exodus render. If you're not familiar with the Exodus Advantage, let me just tell you these 3 things. 5-year, no BS warranty, 5-year theft and damage coverage, and best-in-class customer service. Now's the time to trade up and experience the Exodus render. Do yourself a favor and click the link for all the details on how to claim these savings.
number 2, what do we have here?
We have number 2, I think we are in agreement on this, is terrain. Going back to the creatures of edge and whitetails, I think that applies to, and I think you mentioned this, both habitat and terrain. Now, I think when you get into terrain, there's some driving factors on how whitetails use it, depending on if you're in hill country, bluff country, river bottoms, yada, yada, yada. But identifying certain terrain features, like I'll use hill country, for example, benches, secondary points, like on the leeward side of ridges, like those are a couple things that I always pay a lot of attention to. Not so much saddles as much as some other people. And again, that comes back to my hunting experience, what we see on trail cameras, what we see on the counters, what we see on scouting. I guess to add a third terrain feature in there, it would be drainages, because they create pinch points in hill country where deer are kind of using those, specifically a lot of times in the evenings, because they have thermals pulling down and they can smell everything above them, and then there's no threat of any danger typically down in those drainages.
Why we look for terrain is terrain creates travel. Terrain creates pinches, terrain creates funnels.
Yep.
And those, like you said, it's very important to state that these are starting points, because saddles can offer really great areas to start. Everyone is going to go look at the map and they're going to point out the biggest saddle on that piece and they're going to hunt it. You can catch a buck doing something you want it to do in that area, because there's still going to be sign.
Right.
The deer have to cross there. It's the path of least resistance. So they might avoid it one way or another, and learning how they're using that particular saddle because of the pressure is another way that you can dive into something like on a pretty deep level, just starting in that saddle.
I think that point you just made is so super important. We've seen it, 7+ years running cameras, and I think a lot of guys focus on that a little bit too much. Or maybe they've killed a buck in the rut, sitting in a saddle for 5 or 6 days, and like that's enough conviction for them to do it year over year over year. But man, the daylight stuff that we see on trail cameras just is not there in those big deep saddles, because like you said, it draws so much attention. It's one of the first things people drop pins on when they're digital scouting. So what do you have for your third priority?
So third, we have a mixed bag here. We have food and water lumped together. Like I said, water was kind of up at the top for me, but just to qualify the piece. But obviously, deer need food and water. So food and water is a little bit lower on the list, but it is a must. And with e-scouting, it's really easy to identify ag fields. It's really easy to identify maybe if there's food plots in the area. It's a little bit harder to identify the hard mast. Obviously, you can tell if there's a hardwoods area that might have smoke trees, but if they're dropping or not, you can't determine that.
Right.
So these are areas that are going to offer, again, good starting points. If you start in the food and follow the sign back to the bedding, you covered the entire length of that deer's travel. So food and water, obvious. It's a must on the piece if we're going to spend time there. The last point on here is a big one. We'll let you tackle that.
It is a big one, and it correlates to all the stuff kind of that we've been talking about. But that is bedding. I think over the last handful of years, the mobile hunting scene is just on fire. Bed hunting is hot, and there's good reason for that, because I think if you start to look at success stories over the last decade, a lot of it ties back to understanding and hunting bedding. To
identify bedding via e-scouting, in my opinion, is a lot easier to do in hill country.
It is.
There's a lot of points, and if you understand the way deer bed in hill country, you can almost point at a point, like put a pin on a point and be like, there's going to be a bed up here. Let's go check that out.
Yeah.
And most of the time there is.
Yeah.
So if there's a bunch of different things to look for, but understanding what deer are going to be bedding in those areas is going to be super important.
I think that the general theme there is looking for some type of structure.
Yep.
Looking for some type of structure that adds security cover. So they got to have cover, and it has to be positioned in a way where they have the wind to their advantage. So a lot of times they'll lay on something or a side hill or a point or on the edge of cover where the wind is blowing over their back, and then they also have a visual, some type of visual.
Or noise.
Or noise. Again, deer are not always going to bed in the same type of stuff from swamps to ag to hill country to ag ground. It's not always the same. But those general themes about finding structure with security cover that give them, wind, visual, and audible advantage, that's it.
Bedding is going to be number one for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Bedding's number 4 on here just because it's a little bit harder to identify without putting boots on the ground if you're
100%.
if you're not in hill country. So if you have diversity, you have food and water, you have terrain, you're gonna have bedding.
Yes.
So once you find boots on the ground in the edge, on the terrain features, around the food and water, you'll find the bedding.
Yeah.
So that's why I have it as number 4 and not opposite.
Same way with me. I think, digital scouting, you're looking for starting points for your boots on the ground scouting. Diversity, food, water, terrain will get you a starting point to work towards that bedding. So if you can drop pins, maybe color code them, do whatever you have to do there to where your map is making sense to you. If you find that edge and it has sign and you have a point that you drop that looks like potential bedding, then if that sign coincides with your map, it's ta-ding, light bulb goes off.
Yep, that's the money.